Hello and welcome to the Lloyd's List podcast. I'm Joshua Minchin. I'm a reporter here at Lloyd's List. But taking the reins this week, following the launch of our annual Top 100 Ports publication, is Deputy Editor Linton Nightingale. And you guessed it, we're talking about container ports. The headline takeaway from our report was that the world's premier container ports chalked up a second successive year of muted volume growth during 2023. In a 12-month period that ended with contrasting fortunes for both the leading export and import hubs. The total tally of just over 619 million TEU handled by the top 100 ports represented a 0.8% rise on the previous year, continuing a trend which we've called the tepid 20s post-COVID, with volume growth only marginal. Linton spoke to Drewry senior ports and terminals analyst Eleanor Hadland to look back on how the container port sector fared last year, how it has kicked off 2024, and to find out which factors could upset the apple cart, disrupt the sector, or pose a problem for the volume trajectory, or, on the other hand, inject some impetus into the demand equation through to the end of the year.
Welcome, Eleanor. So let's recap on 2023. There was muted volume growth overall, but it wasn't all doom and gloom. Volume growth was fragmented and there was a clear split between regions and their fortunes.
Yes, well, after the COVID-induced handling boom of 21, where we saw 7% growth, then perhaps the last 2 years need to be seen in that context. So we've had pretty much flat growth. I think we've registered 0.5% in 2022 and 0.3% global growth in 2023. So yes, last year was flat, but you're quite right to say there was regional variations. So last year, the big stories were the downturn in consumer markets. The US demand was down steeply. European and Oceania demand also down. Europe region in particular hit by inflation that capped consumer demand. But we saw strong growth on the inter-Asian market. So Southeast Asia is still benefiting from the China Plus One sourcing strategies. And South Asia has really been booming recently and is emerging as both a considerable import market, but also a growing source of exports for the Western consumer markets.
So there has been concerns over China's economy as well, but there seems to be, they've showed some resilience this year already, and got a quick glance at the half-year throughput figures as well suggests some strong growth in the US as well.
Yes, so when we look at the China figures, so you're quite right to say the China domestic economy is struggling, domestic demand is weak, the property sector is yet to recover. The first quarter figures were pretty strong. Second quarter still showing positive growth, but a more muted growth rate. And we are expecting to see some element of slowdown, but the Chinese market is very much pivoted back towards export growth or export-led growth to support their overall GDP growth. So they're very much focused on those export markets. And they have benefited from the recovery in US consumer demand. But when we see these headline figures of double-digit growth for various US West Coast ports, we need to remember that that's in the context and the double-digit declines we saw last year.
So we've spoken about this before, but let's look at some of the curveballs that threaten to destabilise the container port sector in the remainder of the year. Not just, of course, how they're going to swing demand, but also the other issues that will be on global port operators' minds.
Well, the biggest curveball that absolutely no one saw coming was the Red Sea crisis, but we've seen the carriers adjust to that. There's an emerging new normal in terms of service patterns and which ports are winners and losers. When we look to the second half of the year, we've actually got they're a bit more slow-moving curveballs. So strikes are basically probably the biggest thing that's on carriers and operators' minds if you're operating in the US. So the ILA negotiations are ongoing. The contract's due to end at the end of September. And the sticking points here are the impact of automation on jobs. Basically, the new contract, they have term contracts, so they're looking to make up for some of the inflation that has undermined their spending power in recent years. So it's all about the US East Coast, Gulf Coast negotiations, but a lot of the shippers had already started to factor that in, and that's why we've seen particularly strong growth in US West Coast. But they're not the only strikes on the horizon. We've got rail strikes starting up in Canada, and that's going to impact West Coast North America volumes. And we've also got the risk of dock strikes in India, and there's been ongoing disruption in Germany due to strikes. So this is a problem, I think, largely inflation-led. But there is a concern amongst the port sector about the adaptation of automation and the willingness of labour unions to take on board. I think one of the final curveballs is we've seen greater disruption from extreme weather events. So we've seen storms, high temperatures, fires. All of that over recent years has acted to interrupt both port operations and the supply chain. And I think that links back into the ILO negotiations and the resistance against automation. When you look at the benefits of automation, it's actually really good for the workforce in some instances, because remote control cranes and yard equipment can actually improve working conditions for port operators, because they're able to relocate what was previously a very physically challenging job of sitting in a small glass box above a container ship in 40 degrees heat. That can now be undertaken in a nice air-conditioned office, working as part of a team. And all of that can be quite beneficial. And we've seen several operators, such as Hutchison Ports, really start to push forward those workforce benefits of automation.
Fraudulent transactions within the global trade financing market contribute to an estimated cost of $5 billion each year in total business disruption, according to the International Chamber of Commerce. Lloyd's List Intelligence, through our unique CSearcher Trade Risk solution, provides a comprehensive suite designed to mitigate trade-based money laundering risks in trade finance. By integrating dual-use goods check and price verification into its due diligence processes, through advanced screening tools and real-time data verification, CSearcher Trade Risk helps financial institutions safeguard against fraud and ensure compliance with international regulations. For more information on CSearcher Trade Risk and to book a trial, visit lloydslistintelligence.com or follow the link in the podcast description.
One other curveball as well could be the US elections in November, the Trump factor, so to speak, if he is indeed reinstated for a second term. If, say, Trump does come in, what's going to be the likely outcomes here? I guess more strain on US-Sino relations.
Absolutely, but interestingly, whilst the original Trump presidency was characterised by tariffs, we didn't see these being unwound under the Biden presidency. So the more US-centric view on supporting US manufacturing, reshoring a greater proportion, a lesser reliance on international partners for core goods, I don't see that changing under whichever way the election goes, but I would have said that the rhetoric will certainly be louder under Trump than it will be under a Democratic government. So I would expect probably the direction of tariffs from the US to carry on in this more protectionist way. I don't particularly see that that's going to soften if the Democrats win through, but I will think that it'll be a louder conversation from presidency. And I think the wider geopolitical situation is still a major risk it's worsened in recent years post-COVID. So obviously situation in the Black Sea, situation in the Middle East, and we've still got the risk of Chinese-Taiwanese relations are still very tense. So although that's calmed down a little, it still remains a potential flashpoint for the sector.
Okay, so the other, I guess, the big curveball, or is the big factor that's going on at the moment, is everything in the Red Sea, where everything, or container ships, have had to reroute because of the Houthi attacks. But this recalibration in trade, do you see this now as a permanent fixture? Are we likely to return to typical trading patterns and port rotations, or what was regarded as the norm post the crisis out there?
As and when, and I can't possibly say when, the crisis is solved, then absolutely vessels will start going back through the Red Sea and the Suez. It's by far the more sensible, shorter, cost-effective route for global trade. There's a reason why the Suez Canal was built where it was built. So we will see that shipping lines will over time revert to that route when it's safe to do so. I think one of the interesting points, though, is that if you can look for silver linings in this situation, is that we are starting to see increased connectivity to Africa on account of the Cape of Good Hope diversion. Whilst we're not seeing vessels stopping in southern Africa, what we've started to see is some backhaul calls in Lomé, in Tema, and also in the East African Ocean ports, which are on this diversion route. And that is providing better access into global trade for the African region, which previously they've been very much on the periphery. Now they've got the opportunity for wayport calls, and this could perhaps provide some economic boost to those economies.
We've also looked at the impact on transshipment hubs as well. It's been quite damning for particularly those within the Red Sea and the Saudi ports. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit on how it's impacted the transshipment hubs?
Well, absolutely. You're quite right to say that the Saudi Arabian hubs have been the biggest losers. They no longer receive the wayport call. So Saudi Arabian gateway cargo has either transferred onto Red Sea specific feeders that are coming from Egypt and servicing Jeddah from that direction without going through the southern Red Sea, or much Asian cargo is going into Dammam. What we're increasingly seeing is that because transshipment's a lot more footloose, Colombo picked up a lot of the trade in the initial period, so the first quarter. That then has shifted back towards Singapore, Port Klang picked up, and as soon as congestion hits any of these hubs, the transshipment's moving around. We've had some early stage figures from Tangier Med, and that's doing very well. They did open a new phase. One of the APM terminals had been expanded. So they have plenty of capacity, and they're also one of the most efficient terminals in the world. So they were able to accommodate additional growth. But we're seeing a lot more movement. So if congestion becomes a problem, we're seeing that transshipment traffic move around. But also as the new service patterns have normalised, there's been less need for transshipment as more cargo is being placed onto the service that is going into the Middle East rather than needing to be transhipped to make a connection onto a Middle East feeder network.
Obviously, a lot has been made about how carriers are reaping the rewards of reroutings in terms of earnings. But what about the big port operators? Are they also making money off Red Sea disruption as well?
Yes, just because, as we saw during COVID, the supply chain disruption generally increases dwell time at boxes at the port, and the number of blank sailings we've seen has definitely increased dwell time for both import and export boxes. And increased dwell time means increased service storage charges. So the average revenue per unit handled creeps upwards when dwell time moves upwards, and dwell time moves upwards in response to congestion and disruption of supply chains.
Okay, so finally, let's look at 2025 and beyond. So obviously things can change rather quickly, as we've seen in recent years, but how does Drewry see the fortunes of the port sector over these years? What countries, regions do you think will be the core growth drivers? And where port operators do you think will be looking to grow their footprint?
Okay, so all things being equal, which seems increasingly unlikely in this day and age, then we are expecting to see port growth rates, or global port growth rates, revert to the 2 to 3% range from 2025 onwards. And that's based on the third-party economic forecast. We've been upgrading our forecast our forecast for 2024 on the back of the strong performance, but from 2025 onwards, it will be more muted, back to normal, the new normal of low but positive growth in container throughput. We're seeing stronger growth in Mexico, and that's because of its strategic location as a manufacturing location for the US market. It's part of a free trade agreement with the US and Canada. And what we're seeing is inward investment and greater flows of components into Mexico to support their growing manufacturing sector. We're also seeing some really strong growth in South Asia, and that's expected to grow. And the other parts of emerging Asia and Africa are also the highest growth markets. And when we look at the investment profile of several of the major operators, we're seeing this is where they're targeting their investment. So Abu Dhabi Ports in particular is looking at East Africa and South Asia and Southeast Asia as markets for where it wants to plough its investment into. Dubai Ports World continues to focus on these regions. And the Chinese operators are obviously also increasingly focused on their Asian partners, with investments in Indonesia, for example, and Vietnam moving ahead.
That was Drewry's Eleanor Hadland speaking with Lloyd's List Deputy Editor Linton Nightingale. If that's whetted your appetite for more cutting-edge insight into the container sector, then Lloyd's List subscribers can access the full edition of our latest 100 ports publication online now, with all the analysis and data behind those numbers. A print edition will also be on its way very soon indeed. That's where we're going to leave it this week, but you can listen to our entire back catalogue on demand wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, we'll be back next week to discuss the best ship money can buy. Thanks for listening. See you next week. Bye-bye.